Hi, my name's Nicholas Dobb. I'm from ZestQuest and I'm really glad that you could join me today for this fantastic workshop that I've got for you. Now, I know I've spoken to a few of you before and I realise that it's a very common thing that we have these times where there's a bit of conflict with people that we know and that there can be friction and the communication can be challenging and there's the potential for resentments to set in, for more challenging, for arguments and all sorts of things. But how do you avoid that? How do you improve the quality of relationships? And in doing that, how do you get more freedom in your life? How do you take control of what you're doing so that you don't have the conflict, so you can give that relationship the best opportunity? Now, would you like to find out 4 steps to having more freedom in your life, more freedom in your relationships, so that you feel stronger within yourself and you can actually, you can operate from your heart center and who you truly are. And that's what I want for you. So come along. And if you don't know already, ZestQuest, there's a catchphrase, and I love using catchphrases and acronyms and mantras and all that sort of thing. So the catchphrase for ZestQuest is less stress, more zest. And I'm inviting you to come along and have some more zest in your life. All right, here's my friend, happy face. That's what we want. I want happy faces for everyone. Now I'm going to share with you from a session I had with one of my clients, because I like to share concepts with clients and give them reference points like mantras, like acronyms and that sort of thing. And I had this session with the client and things landed in a particular way and just unpacked a concept that I've shared with him before and many of my other clients. And I'd like to share that with you because it gives a framework for resolving those challenging situations I referenced before. And one of the fundamental things that we looked at is the first part of the concept is that the way we interact, our behaviors, are kind of on a scale or a spectrum. And so at one end of the spectrum, shall we borrow his eyes? Yeah, let's do it. Pop. See, something I prepared a little earlier. Now it's a little bit subjective, but we've got this spectrum here and our sets of behaviors can be unhealthy or they can be healthy. And because it's a spectrum, that they can fall anywhere along here. So if we had this arbitrary halfway point, now if I compare it to, say, things that I eat, what foods are healthy and what foods are unhealthy, and you can probably bring a few to mind straight away. So if I said I like to eat fruit and vegetables, would you say they're healthy or unhealthy foods? Correct, healthy. So depending on exactly what I'm eating, it might be somewhere on the scale up here. But then if I said I actually prefer to eat organic fruits and vegetables, and you might slide it further up the scale. And we can explore that. And if I like to have some pre-made meals, and you might say, okay, that they're processed and they're not as nutritious, and you might find some that might be a vegetable curry, for instance, and it's sitting over here. But then, of course, we've got our takeaway foods and deep fried foods, and we know that they're not as healthy. If we had a diet purely on takeaway foods, our health would suffer because we're not getting enough nutrition out of it. And that's pretty well known and accepted. Would you agree? Yeah. So we can have certain types of unhealthy foods that are possibly here on the spectrum, and then we can go really unhealthy foods and slide down there. And as I said before, it's going to impact your well-being. And in the same concept, our behaviors fall on a scale. They're not necessarily good or bad. They're not necessarily right or wrong. They just fall somewhere on this scale. And yes, we can have unhealthy behaviors and we can have healthy behaviours. So if I'm yelling and screaming, carrying on at someone, it's definitely going to fall into this spectrum. But if I'm calm and interact with someone from a conscious point of view and share with them my perspective, even if they disagree, then we can say it's probably on the healthy side of that spectrum. And that's what we want to look. We want to have more healthy behaviours and less unhealthy behaviours. And that's partly what today's all about, is how can you do that? What steps can you take when you've got that situation, a bit of a standoff perhaps, or some resentment building? And of course, family members can be some of our most challenging. So, hands up, who's had conflict with a family member? Yeah, a lot of hands there. And who's had conflict that has dragged on for a while? Yeah, a few less, but it's there. It's not uncommon, it happens. So how can you resolve this? And I think one of the key things to really understand that before you begin is you have certain controls. And importantly, you have controls over you. How you behave, how you interact. And I'm the boss of myself, and you are the boss of yourself. You're in control. And so you can take responsibility. It's easy to abdicate, it's easy to play a victim, but we're not about that. This is having more control in your life, and with that, a better outcome. So I've got this saying with one of my clients, with a lot of my clients in fact, that to remind them respectively that I am the boss. And so I'd like you to say that to yourselves. I am the boss. And this is not in a conceited way or a destructive way. It's not with any animosity towards anyone. It's really only about me. It's how I treat me. That I don't let other people dictate to me who I am, what my beliefs are. Because I am the boss of me. And that's coming from a very empowered center. It's my personal power, engaging my personal power. So when I say this, and what I shared with my client is that this is when he's standing in his personal power. When he's standing in his personal power, he has empowerment. And I do like to use the word empowerment as opposed to powerful, because empowerment to me is the embodiment of personal power. And it's not the power over anybody else. It's just my power that comes within. And we all have it. But some of us, well, perhaps you've forgotten it. Perhaps you don't even realize you've got it. Because you feel like you've been the victim of circumstances and other people's behaviors, that things didn't quite go right as you're growing up, or relationships that you've had. And certainly, you may have fallen victim to some unhealthy behaviors from somebody else, and it's had a big impact in your life. So not disregarding that. But realizing that no matter where you're at, you have personal power, and therefore you can engage your empowerment. And that doesn't mean you just flick a switch. If you're not used to it, this is something to develop. To not just develop as a way of actions, but actually a way of feeling, and to recognize your own personal power. So empowerment is really important. And then also realizing that, and we're going to call that number one, having empowerment. So I think what I might share with you is, and I have asked my client for permission to share his story, and it really gave us an opportunity to explore something of how he interacted and can interact moving forward with an important member of his family. And in his circumstance, it's one of his grandmothers. And he's been having more contact with his grandmother lately. This is a young man that's about 28 years old. And so he's an adult. He's been an adult for a while. And what's been happening is Grandma's been treating him as an 8-year-old. Forgetting that at times, of course, she treats him like an adult, and other times she treats him like an 8-year-old, because that's what she's done so well for so many years. She's been a wonderful, caring, nurturing grandmother. However, he's not 8. And this is where it's important for my client to realize that he's the boss. Grandma isn't the boss. So my client and his grandmother had had conflict. They'd had an argument. And he's been working on himself and developing personal growth and becoming more empowered. And with this argument, at one point in time, as things started to escalate, his grandmother stood up and said, "You just have to shut up and listen to me." How would that make you feel? How would you respond to that? Would you cower? Hide? Some people go into a bathroom to escape. What would you do? Or would you stand up and retaliate, telling Grandma not to treat you like a little boy anymore or a little girl? What would you do? Well, my client recognized that he's the boss. And he recognized that he could take some action. So he actually said, "I don't need this and I'm going to leave." And so he did. And he diffused the situation by leaving the environment and no longer arguing, no longer engaging, because he realized that not only had Grandma escalated, but he was on the verge of escalating and perhaps saying things that he might have regretted. Perhaps saying things that Grandma might have then had further resentment. And the whole situation could have really escalated, but he cut it short. So there's a positive thing. But several days later, about 4 or 5 days later, is when I had the session with him. And he's now saying, or I said to him, "What are your next steps?" And he wasn't sure. And this is why we unpacked this. He wasn't sure. And there's always more than one way of doing things. So one way could be going back to Grandma and groveling and going, "Hey, I'm really sorry. And, I didn't mean to upset you, Grandma. And I want everything to be wonderful between us. And yes, I didn't say the right thing or do the right thing." But that wouldn't have been that man being true to himself. And so he would have actually been behaving on the unhealthy scale of things. And just for the exercise, what we did, we nominated values and went from 0 to 100. And as we were unpacking this, I asked him to rate certain things. So I said to him, if you did go groveling back to Grandma, apologizing profusely and almost taking all the blame, I said, "How would you feel? And is that really healthy behavior?" He said, "No, it wouldn't be healthy," which I agreed. And I asked him to rate between 0 and 100. Where on that scale he would put that behavior? And he told me 35, which I thought was a fair comment, because it wouldn't have resolved the issue, the relationship between this man and his grandmother. And so through the process that we were doing, the whole thing was, what's he going to do next? How does he move forward? And we looked at different options along the way. And that was just one of them. And whilst there's two people, he's only responsible for himself. And that was a key thing. That we said, this is your responsibility. So it's up to my client to take responsibility for his actions. And there's a lovely little process that I love to do when I reach junctures and I'm trying to decide which way to go, how to behave, what to say, what to do. And I ask myself two really important questions. And this is something I do. What's the most authentic thing I can say? And what's the most authentic thing I can do? And when I put that filter there as I'm processing a situation, coming back to what's the most authentic thing I can say and what's the most authentic thing I can do. So we already identified that there was one concept of he could go back apologising profusely and playing victim. That was unhealthy. And I said, well, what's another option? And he said, well, I could kind of just wait for her to come and apologise. And we realised that could have been a standoff because Grandma could have been waiting for him to apologise. He could be waiting for Grandma to apologise. And that could have lasted for weeks, even months. Because that happens, and I've seen it happen. And yet what happens in those circumstances, whilst one party's waiting for the other to apologise, they're not actually prepared to apologise themselves. And maybe there's an alternative where neither has to apologise. Both can recognise what's happened and then move on. And that's really where we're heading. So realise that waiting for Grandma ended up on this end of the scale. And again, I asked him, where would you put that? And it was around about a 40. And again, this is subjective, so you may feel differently, but for him, he said that's going to be about a 40. And I said, well, okay, it's your responsibility. And if we put it through that filter of being authentic to oneself. So what's the most authentic thing I can say? What's the most authentic thing I can do? And that's the filter. Now, sometimes, depending on circumstances, saying nothing and even doing nothing can be the right choice. And that is being authentic. And so by doing this, by coping with these ups and downs, because life will always deliver that, we realised that his approach of being responsible, that he wasn't avoiding the confrontation, but he was dealing with the circumstances. And we realised that this is resilience. Resilience. Got to spell it correctly. And that in this situation, he's exercising his resilience. That's going to be point number 2. Now, as we continue to unpack this, and we want to explore, we've already found 2 unhealthy options, we're going to be exploring some healthy options. But before we went any further, we covered the fact of what's his grandmother's situation. And now this isn't particularly his grandmother, and certainly wasn't anything about targeting his grandmother or victimizing his grandmother. That's the whole thing. We want this to be a wholesome result. We want it to be a win-win. And so when we looked at this, and we considered Grandma on this particular occasion, we realised that she has certain beliefs, that she's got certain perspectives, that she's looking at the situation through her lens and how she's seeing that. What else? We also realised that whilst my client has got some stuff, he's got his baggage, so too does Grandma. And not to use this against her, just to be aware of it. But she too has a baggage. And within that, there might be some fears and insecurities that are affecting her behaviours. Because we'd also acknowledged that when Grandma jumped up and yelled at my client, that she was acting in the unhealthy spectrum. And we didn't bother qualifying that at the time. So, knowing that Grandma has these things, we can actually be compassionate, because that's where being authentic is finding a result that gives the best opportunity for a good outcome. However, my client was only responsible for his behaviours and reactions. He cannot be responsible for Grandma's responses and reactions. However, we can give it the best shot. And it's important to notice that with this, no matter what he chooses to do, that, where are we going to put it? I'd even try a different colour. That we need to manage expectations. And in that is not to be too rigid of, if I do this, someone else will say that. If I say this, they're going to respond to me the way I want them to respond. That if I behave a particular way, that they won't necessarily do what I'd like. So there needs to be, within our expectations, is really to limit them and allow the other person to respond the way they need to respond. In this case, grandma, with her beliefs and perspectives, with her baggage and some fears and insecurities. The things that are driving her, the things that she's probably done for decades. But we're wanting to hijack the confrontation and turn it around. I then said to my client, well, we identified 2 strategies that end up on the unhealthy side of the spectrum. And I asked him, what's a healthy way of responding? And what he came up with, he mentioned the first one was that he could have a conversation with grandma. And when he was sharing this with me, it was having a conversation about having conversations. That having a conversation to share with grandma that he is an adult now. And it's appropriate for her to treat him like an adult and no longer treat him as a child. It's also a conversation where grandma can express things and he can listen and he can respond. And he'd had a conversation about conversations with his grandpa not too long before this incident, 3 or 4 weeks before. And it had a positive outcome. In fact, grandpa came to him and said, I've realized that when you pause, that you're processing and considering things, and that when I start talking, it's actually interrupting you and I haven't given you the opportunity. And this was just an amazing revelation for my client, because it's exactly what was happening. And he was thrilled that his papa had the insight to, if you like, pause and look at my client. And so their relationship has already started to develop in a much healthier way. So that was one option. But he wasn't quite sure whether grandma was ready for that. And then he realized that there's other ways of communication that doesn't have to be the conversation about conversations. And we just categorize it as communication. And what it was is not so much a sit-down conversation about conversations, but to tailor his communication through this filter of being authentic to himself, and what's the most authentic thing he can say, what's the most authentic thing he can do. So we can share with grandma some things that are happening in his life that he knew grandma had interest in. And he didn't necessarily have to apologize and compromise himself, but he can say he's sorry for the situation. He can say he doesn't want this to build any resentments. And he can invite her to have a healthier level of communication between the two. And so we realised, and we nominated that, and I said, well, where would you put that on the spectrum? And he said, oh, well, if I did this, either of these two, there's 2 different strategies, and he rated them to be about 70-80%, or 75 to 80 on the scale there. And it's subjective. I've got to say that again. This numbers that I'm giving you, they're subjective, and this was relevant for my client. So he said, yeah, around that 75 to 80, that's where I'd put either one of those 2. And I said, well, what's your preference? And he went, this one. And at a later time, he can come back to the other strategy. So he identified these, but nothing's happened at the moment. I said, well, do you want to? Do you want to do this? And he said, absolutely. Because I don't want things to go down that rabbit hole of further tensions and resentments for himself or for grandma because he cares about her. So I said, okay, great. And he said, yeah. And we discussed how he was going to go about that. So he identified that he was going to take action. Firstly was finding some options of what he could do, putting it through the filter of being authentic, realizing that he was coping with the situation with resilience, realizing that it's his responsibility to do something, that he doesn't need to wait for anybody else. Because this wasn't about grandma, it was about him. Grandma just happened to be the topic in this particular occasion, because these principles apply to any relationship. So in taking action, I said, that's engagement. He's not just merely standing by. He's engaging in the whole situation with his empowerment, with his resilience, and now take engagement. And that became number 3. And that when he did this, as long as he did it to the best of his ability through his own filters of how it was being authentic to himself, to his grandmother, having some compassion towards her, realizing that she's got her own belief system and her own baggage, and he doesn't have to take that on board. Realizing that she may respond favorably or not, and that managing his expectations and allowing grandmother to be who she is, allowing that person. And I asked him, if you took this path, how do you think you might feel? What feelings would you have? Or emotions? And you've probably heard, hands up with those who have heard, emotions is like energy in motion. And it's the energy within us. So I asked him, what feelings might he get out of this? And he said, well, firstly, peace. Because he'd been sitting with discomfort of this standoff that had happened and not knowing where it was going to go, and before the session not knowing what he was going to do. But now we had a strategy. So he said, even now he'd felt peace, a sense of calm coming through his body because he knew that he could do this. And he also said that he'd had that sense of being in control, which reflects that empowerment again. And we also realised that if he does this well, right up onto that healthy scale, then he's giving the situation the best opportunity that he's capable of. And if he's feeling this peace, if he's feeling in control, he said it feels a bit more like a win-win, and that it's not competitive, but it's supportive. And that way he can have a healthy relationship with, in this case, his grandma. So acknowledge that this was the 4th part, that there'd be more fulfillment. And that is number 4. More fulfillment by taking control of the situation, identifying that he's got the personal power, knowing he's got the resilience to cope, engaging in the situation, and benefiting, having that fulfillment. So I said, well, wouldn't it be nice to have that sense of fulfillment? He said, yes. Realizing that you've got the resilience to cope with that. By engaging your empowerment and engaging in the situation. I said, so if you've got all of that, how would you feel? He said, I would have freedom. And that's what I say with this 4-step process, is that if you do this, you start to enter your free domain. Who'd like some of that? Yes. All right. Fantastic. It's pretty simple. It's free. That's your acumen. If you want to be more free, if you want to feel better within yourself, if you want to improve relationships that are challenging at times, then recognize your own empowerment. Handle the situation with resilience and put it through that filter of being authentic to yourself and others. Making your expectations realistic and allowing that they won't always be as you desire them to be, because that is allowing the other person to be who they are. And just because you desire to act from the healthy end of the scale doesn't automatically mean that somebody else will meet you there, but you're giving it the best opportunity. It takes action. You've got to do something about it. And as I said before, sometimes that action is doing nothing or saying nothing, but you'll need to work that out. And finally, recognizing the benefits of it, feeling the benefits, feeling the emotions, feeling the energy. So it gives you confidence and encouragement to have more peace, to be in control, and all those other positive feelings, to have more joy, more confidence, more surety and certainty in your life, more enthusiasm, all of that. That's how you get your free domain. It takes practice. Sometimes it can be challenging to put yourself into this situation. But I'd love to support you through that journey, and if you want to know more about how you can do that, how you can take control of your life to have more freedom, then please come see me, because isn't it great to have less stress, more zest? Go ahead. Be zesty, have a great day. Thank you for joining me today. It's been wonderful.